Shalom, dear friends. Greetings to all of you. I'm glad to see you all. Shalom to everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Wishing everyone a wonderful mood. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the like button, the bell, and click the thank you button. So, we are now at the 11th lesson of our course After the Flame. This lesson is called Israel and the Church. From the year 70 to 325. The course is designed to last about 13 weeks. Today, we are only at lesson 11 out of 65. And we are diving, you could say, into the most difficult and painful period in history. This is about the relationship between those who stayed with Israel, that is, the synagogue, and those who went towards the emerging church, which by that time was becoming more and more distinctly Gentile in character. We're talking about all these issues today. But if you think that everything is clear to us and that we can truly grasp the depths of what happened, in reality, you're mistaken. We actually have very few definite answers. To understand everything that happened, it's not enough to grasp the spiritual background. You also absolutely need to understand the historical context. That's exactly what we're going to talk about. In order to distinguish the era of the Acts of the Apostles from the second generation that followed, we need to understand what happened. After all, there were tragic events that changed the face of the world. That is, the face of the world of Israel, in fact, the face of the Jewish people, and these events also determined the course of the church's development. For example, if all these situations were unfolding today, in our time, there wouldn't be such tragedy, it simply wouldn't happen. All the tragedy of existence and the division into black and white, into US and enemies, this is the result of historical events. Insularity, closeness, and the attempt of some to preserve themselves as a people, an ethnic group, and a nation, while at the same time others are trying to find a way to survive. Usually, a religious person knows very little about this history. And all our understanding of the historical background ends with the book of Acts of the Apostles. And we only have, let's say, different fragments of knowledge and understanding. A little bit here, a little bit there, some over here, some over there. We are unable to form a complete picture of what is happening in our subconscious. My goal is to create with you one big series that you can always refer back to, because it will be available on our playlist, so that you have a sequence of events and an understanding of the era, the transitional periods from one era to another. Then you will realize that, in fact, the issue was not only spiritual, or even not spiritual at all, but rather a political and historical one, which was influenced by, that is, which was affected by spiritual development as well. That's why today we are talking with you and continue to talk with you, and we're kind of summing up the weeks during which we've been studying our course. As I already mentioned, our course is designed to last about 13 weeks. And today is only our 11th lesson. That's it. In the previous lessons, we basically laid the foundation for today's discussion. We witnessed the horror of the siege of Jerusalem. Believe me, many believers don't even know about this. They don't study this history at all. But the siege of Jerusalem is one of the most important stories that needs to be studied. That's where we started. We started precisely on this path. Through the eyes of Josephus Flavius, we went through all the events. In our minds, we stood before the ruins of the temple. We asked where the Shekinah had gone. What would happen now to the divine presence? We spoke about the spiritual collapse, about the titanic efforts of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Gamliel II from Jabna, who literally gathered the Jewish people piece by piece, as much as could still be gathered at that time. But you see, it wasn't just about creating a religion, it was about survival itself. No one was even thinking about creating a religion back then. Judaism existed at that time, but it was a different Judaism. It was the Judaism of the Second Temple. Now, how do you live without the temple? How do you exist without a heart? Can a person live without a heart? You see what I mean? I mean, a person might be able to live without a brain, but how can they live without a heart? That's why the codification of the oral Torah began. They started saving knowledge because rabbis were being killed, sages were disappearing, and the Torah itself was vanishing along with their memories. They began to write down what was remembered. They started to codify it. At the same time, we touched on the point of how believers in Yeshua asked themselves the same questions, but they found slightly different answers. But again, the questions were exactly the same. How to celebrate Passover without a temple? After all, the disciples went to church. But again, the age of deeds, the era of the apostles has passed. The second era has begun. Angelica, shalom. Thank you. How can one remain faithful to the Torah? Back then, there was no New Testament canon. The only canon was the canon of the Tanakh, and the foundation or the center of the Tanakh was the Torah itself. Now, how do you stay faithful to the Torah when the synagogue rejects you and calls you a heretic? And how did it happen that the name Yeshua, the Hebrew name Yeshua, came to sound like the Greek Christos for so many people in the world? And this is where the process of separation begins. But it's not just about that. That's just a small nuance. And there are a lot of nuances and many points of separation. Today, we will try to connect all these threads. And that's why the question we're raising today is the question of synagogue and church. This isn't just a theological debate. If you think this is a theological debate, it's not a theological debate at all. Or at least, not only that. For people at the end of the first and the beginning of the second century, it was a national choice. A question of survival. Where will your children pray, for example? With whom will your family sit at the Seder table? Who will bury you according to your faith? These questions are very important, especially for the Jewish people who were still holding on at that time. Maybe these questions were already less important for a Greco-Roman person living in Corinth, or in Antioch, or in Ephesus. But nevertheless, all these questions existed, and it was necessary to find suitable answers to them. They didn't exist in the Acts of the Apostles, because in the Acts of the Apostles it was clear who you were. You were a Jew who belonged to Israel. And those who were not Jews were given an easy, simple path, and in the end, they became Jews as well. Everything was clear, everything had long been studied, and everything was already divided up. But when the entire Jewish world collapsed, when the heart was torn out by the roots, a lot of questions arose. A whole lot of questions. It wasn't just a destroyed building. The temple was the center of the universe. It was the place where heaven met earth. Yeshua went to the temple. Did he offer sacrifices? Of course he did, both thanksgiving offerings and prayers. Every Jew, 3 times a year, if he didn't live in Jerusalem, would regularly make pilgrimages, sometimes even more often. Did Yeshua observe the mikveh? Of course he did. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to enter the temple. Did he keep kosher? Absolutely, he did. No question about it. And all the disciples kept the commandments. They were devout Jews. Sacrifices were offered in the temple. That was where a person received forgiveness for their sins. No one had any doubt about how all of this worked, the place where the Shekinah was supposed to dwell. And now, that center is gone. The flames consumed not only the stones, but an entire worldview as well. And as we've already mentioned in our course, I recommend you listen to all the lessons starting from the very first one. This was a true spiritual collapse. We haven't yet studied the deaths of the apostles, but we will definitely cover that next week. So, in this vacuum, 2 powerful parallel responses emerge. The first response, give me Jabna and its sages. This is what we studied with you about Rabbi Gamliel. This is what paved the way for Rabbinic Judaism. So the sages were faced with an incredible challenge. How do you live without a heart? How can Judaism survive now? And they gave a simple answer that had existed since the time of the Babylonian exile. That is, prayer, repentance, and good deeds or charity. Prayers were organized to replace the temple sacrifices, and they were also scheduled according to the times of the temple offerings, that is, morning, noon, and evening. The study of the Torah became the highest form of serving God, and the synagogue, which had been a place for local gatherings during the time of the Second Temple, truly became a small temple. Rabban Gamliel restored the Sanhedrin. And it was the Sanhedrin that began to strictly define the boundaries of what is Judaism and what is not Judaism. Now, again, if all this had happened today, there wouldn't be any problems, because today there aren't even these boundaries. Today we have this kind of Judaism, we have Hasidic Judaism, we have modernized Judaism, we have many movements, no one is fighting with anyone, no one has killed anyone. You might not accept each other, but it doesn't change anything. But that's today. Back then, it was a different time. It was a survival strategy through consolidation, a clear definition of identity. You couldn't blur your concepts even by a millimeter. You had to clearly define, this is yes, and this is no. And there could be no shades or nuances, because it was a matter of survival. The second response is the growing, developing path of the community of Yeshua's believers. For them, The destruction of the temple was not only a tragedy, but also a confirmation of their teacher's prophecies. He said that not one stone would be left upon another in the temple, and Yeshua predicted this. To even think about this, or imagine it, was absolutely impossible. But even for them, this created a terrible crisis. Now, how can sin be atoned for without sacrifices? An answer was found. That sacrifice is the Messiah, and it was made on the cross at Golgotha. And Yeshua himself, his death and resurrection, is the event that defines Yom Kippur for our souls. Does this cancel Yom Kippur? No. It gives it a new meaning. Now we have two paths that begin to diverge. For some, the center shifted to the teachings of the sages and the synagogue. And the synagogue closed its doors and built a wall, which was necessary for survival. There were no other options. For others, there were new interpretations and an attempt to form a community of the Messiah. At this time, which we are studying, the period between the 1st and 2nd centuries, they still exist side by side, but their trajectories are already different. Their paths are already diverging. Now let's note that all of this is happening against the backdrop of a vast diaspora. That is, Jews and believers. Jews still live in Alexandria, in Antioch, in Babylonia. Each of these centers had its own nuances of self-identification. Jews throughout the Roman Empire are on the brink of survival and destruction. We will talk about this with you. We will talk with you about the uprising in the diaspora. Not everyone even knows that this happened. But there was an uprising in the diaspora, which was suppressed in the harshest way, in an extremely brutal way. It was terrifying, and we will also study this event together. We will also talk about the uprising of Rabbi Akiva, who proclaimed Bar Kokhba the Messiah. Many people see this as only a spiritual defeat for Rabbi Akiva. But, my friends, you forget that Rabbi Akiva made titanic decisions. Even despite his profound misconceptions, he did this consciously, and had he not done so, it is quite possible that Israel would not exist at all. And we will also study and discuss these things together. Now let's take a closer look at those who found themselves right on the fault line. We talked about this with you earlier this week. These are two Jewish groups. One is the Nazarenes, or so-called Nazrim, the keepers, from the root. Essentially, this is the original community of Yeshua's disciples, whose beginnings trace back to Jerusalem and Galilee. They were simply Jews. The church fathers simply said about them, they're just Jews. What else can you expect from them? In other words, the fact that they are heretics is just a consequence of them being Jews, because all Jews are heretics. According to the early church fathers, this was obvious. They were zealous for the Torah, they observed Shabbat, kept kosher, and circumcised their sons. They went to synagogue. The only thing that set them apart was that they were convinced Yeshua of Nazareth was the promised Messiah. But after all, Hasidim also believe in their Hasidic Rebbes and also call them Mashiach. Basically, if we didn't have all this history and all these events that unfolded in a spiral, we would be studying them all the way up to our days. I don't know how many years that would take. No problem. Today, this wouldn't cause any issues at all. But nowadays, every Jew who hears the word Christ has a red warning light go off in their mind, because immediately all the historical events come to mind: forced baptisms, crusades, conversions, and so on and so forth. The whole history doesn't just disappear. It's impossible to forget it, to switch it off, to disconnect from it. You simply can't turn it off. You see what I mean? After all, Israel exists today in spite of the entire theology of the Christian Church, which for centuries claimed that it had replaced Israel. And suddenly Israel appeared in spite of this theology, disproving the very foundation of that doctrine. So how do you expect these paths to coexist today? They can't coexist because they've been in opposition to each other for centuries. We'll talk more about this at the end. Now, the next group is the Ebionites, from the word Ebion, meaning poor or destitute, most likely taken from the Sermon on the Mount. The words of Yeshua, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," that is, the poor. Like the Nazarenes, they strictly observed the Torah of Moses. But, judging by the accounts of later church fathers, they had differences in their understanding of the person of Yeshua. Many of them believed that he was the greatest prophet, a man upon whom the Holy Spirit descended at the moment of baptism. They did not consider him to be God from eternity. The Nazarenes also did not consider him to be God from eternity. They regarded him as divine. In principle, I agree with him. The Mashiach must be divine. He definitely carries within himself the sparks of the Creator, his components and essence. But the Ebionites had various other issues. For example, they also did not accept the apostleship of Paul, and so on. This was not a problem for the Nazarenes, because the Nazarenes understood Paul perfectly well and knew exactly what he was talking about and what he wrote. The Ebionites desperately tried to remain within the boundaries of the Jewish world, but were rejected by both camps. The synagogue said no, and the growing Gentile church could not accept their low Christology. Their Christology was even called low. Later, the concept of high Christology emerged. We will study that in later periods. Their low Christology, in relation to Christ and the requirements to observe the Torah, was something the others could not accept. Their story is the tragedy of a group that tried to hold together what was visibly coming apart before the eyes of the whole world. Again, if they were alive today, in our times, there would be no problems at all. Each of these groups could have started their own denomination and thrived, just like the countless other movements that exist in the world today. No one would have persecuted them because we live in an era of religious freedom. But such freedoms did not exist back then. At that time, the concept of religious freedom simply didn't exist. Back then, everything was divided into us and them, friend and foe, black and white. You were either with us or against us. There was no other way. That's why I always say that we are living in the best times ever. And it's precisely in these times that we've been entrusted to do what we do. We would never have been able to do this in another world or in another era. Of course, the question arose whether the legacy of the Apostle Paul, Rav Shaul, was still alive. Now, for the communities that were emerging in the Greco-Roman world, this became the dominant force. The communities that Paul founded in Greece and Asia Minor were made up mostly of non-Jews. For them, the question of identity was posed in a completely different way. They sort of accepted the unity of the Creator and didn't even mind that this was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They accepted that Yeshua is the King of Israel, and that he is from Israel, and that he is, in fact, a Jew. But they themselves were not Jews. They had never lived a Jewish way of life. No one circumcised them on the 8th day after birth. No one taught them how to put on tefillin. They never had talits, and they had never kept kashrut in their lives. So, what were they supposed to do now? Should they become Jews? Paul answered, "No, your identity is not nationality, but only spiritual kinship with Israel through the Messiah." In other words, if you are not born a Jew, then you can't just become one like that. That path is very difficult, but through the Messiah you are grafted onto this vine. Basically, that was Paul's idea. I agree with this idea as well. It's a wonderful idea because if we take the synagogue's approach, it's impossible to implement on a large scale. But here lies another problem. As soon as we make an exception and leave people at the same level they were at, and say that if you're not Jewish, then you're a Gentile, and therefore you don't need the commandments of the Torah, this triggers a different line of thinking, which, in fact, is what everything eventually led to. And that's what created enormous tension. For believing Jews, like the Nazarenes, abandoning the Torah was seen as a betrayal. For Gentiles, on the other hand, the requirement to observe the Torah seemed like a strange barrier. Now, how can Jews who observe the commandments of the Torah and are supposed to gather on Shabbat coexist with non-Jews who don't want to gather on Shabbat, but want to gather on Sunday? How can they exist together in one community when some Jews want to keep kosher, while others are throwing feasts with non-kosher food? How can these two people coexist? How can Jews who observe the Torah live in the same community with pagans who do not observe the Torah? The divide grew even wider. Now, Paul's communities, as they saw themselves, began to gather separately. Their day gradually shifted from Saturday to the first day of the week to Sunday in memory of the fact that Yeshua rose on a Sunday. In reality, we understand that Yeshua rose, and people came on Sunday because it was forbidden to visit the cemetery on Shabbat. Well, all right, we understand that. Now, how can Jews who believe in Yeshua be the same as Gentiles who also believe in him? And how can they come to terms with the fact that some want to observe Shabbat in the same community while others do not? And here, a huge number of problems arose. All external forces were pressing on this: cultural forces, spiritual forces, and also political forces. First of all, Hellenistic philosophy. the educated people of that time. The educated people of that era thought in the categories of Plato and Aristotle. But the Nazarenes did not think in the categories of Plato and Aristotle. They had Jewish thought. But in order to explain faith in Yeshua to them, it was necessary to speak in the language of the Greeks. That's how the first apologists appeared, who tried to combine biblical faith and Greek wisdom. Now, how can Jews remain in this community when a preacher comes to the pulpit and preaches Aristotelian philosophy seasoned with the Bible? Gnosticism is a powerful intellectual and spiritual movement. After all, the Gnostics taught that our material world is nothing but a mistake, a prison created by an evil and ignorant God. And many identified this God with the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh. And Yeshua is a messenger from the true world. He is a spiritual God who brought secret knowledge, gnosis, to save our souls, the spark, from this prison. Gnosticism was very dangerous because it completely severed the connection with the Jewish roots of the faith, turning Yeshua from a man who walked the earth into a mythical savior rather than the Jewish Mashiach. In the struggle against Gnosticism, the Church was forced to define even more clearly what we believe in. We believe in God the Creator, but gradually this was removed. We believe in God the Creator, and that's it. It was no longer said, we believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and in future canons of faith, and in the tenets of faith, and in the creeds. Nowhere does it say that we believe in the God of Abraham. This is already a clear cut. Now, how could the Nazarenes coexist with the Gentiles in this paradigm when the leaders of these communities did not want to live a Jewish life? Now, when you think about this, you realize that these concepts cannot be combined in any way. And when you think that Jews are simply supposed to become one new person, and they all just have to become the church. My friends, that's only in fairy tales. It's impossible. A Jew who is supposed to become part of the church has to say goodbye to his Jewishness. He has to stop being a Jew. He's not even allowed to think about it. He has to forget it like a bad dream. But they didn't want to forget who they were and where they came from. And that's why their paths diverge. This is shown to us by the Didache, the lesson we studied yesterday. It's an amazing document called The Teaching of the 12 Apostles. We don't have the certainty that everything written there is truly the original. But at the very least, we have some manuscripts kept somewhere in England that date back to the year 1050. And the Church Fathers, who mentioned this in the year 400, also refer to it. But anyway, it's simply the charter of a community from the end of the 1st century. We talked about this with you, I think, yesterday. Well, let's talk a little about this, because it starts with a purely Jewish concept of two ways, the way of life and the way of death. And listen to how, interestingly, the way of life is described. The first commandment, the teaching in general, is love God who created you. The second is your neighbor as yourself. And whatever you do not wish to happen to you, do not wish for another person either. These are, essentially, commandments from the Torah. These are the words of Yeshua himself. There is no dogma here at all. It doesn't say here which persons you have to believe in. It doesn't describe here the whole deep, subsequent explanation of the three deities. But even then, in the Didache, we already see interesting details that point to a process of separation. The Didache says, "But when you fast, do not fast with the hypocrites." This uses a verse from the Gospel of Matthew, "Do not be like the hypocrites, for they fast on the 2nd and 5th days of the week. But you should fast on Wednesday and Friday." Monday and Thursday were the traditional fasting days for the Pharisees. The author directly says, we don't want to do as they do. It's a small step, but SHHH, a very important step. This is already a step toward their own identity. The same goes for prayer. Do not pray like the hypocrites, but as the Lord commanded in his gospel, our Father, and so on. This prayer is prescribed to be recited 3 times a day, which, in general, very much resembles the practice of 3 daily prayers in Judaism. But their content is replaced with something new, purely Christian. So we can already see that when it became clear that after the Acts of the Apostles, no one ascended, and it was clear that Mashiach ben David had not come, and it was clear that life had to go on. Even then, it was clear that something needed to be done. In other words, the Didache is a perfect snapshot of a transitional period. That is, its soul and ethics are purely Jewish, but the ritual practices are no longer Jewish and no longer synagogue-based. This is already a very important illustration of the problem between the church and the synagogue. The division is obvious. So, what do we have by the end of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century? We have an extremely complex picture. Again, if this had happened today, it's quite possible that none of this would have occurred. But all of this did not happen today. It was not a simple and clear choice, as it might seem to us. It was a struggle for the very soul of the movement. Israel was fighting, Jews were fighting in general for the survival of their people. And in turn, the Christian community was trying to figure out who it should be. On one hand, Jewish believers like the Nazarenes were desperately holding onto their roots, while on the other hand, communities made up of Gentiles were forming a new culture. Endless debates arose within about the identity of Yeshua, the role of the Torah, what was necessary, what wasn't, what had been, what hadn't. From the outside, there was pressure from the rabbis on the Jews, and the Greeks faced pressure from Greek philosophy. So what became the point of no return? It wasn't just a single factor that you could point to and say, that's it. It was a combination of many different paths. In other words, by that time, 2 theological worlds were already developing. These were the world of Alexandria and the world of Antioch. That is, if we're talking about the Christian world. The Antiochian world still more or less resembled the world of Unitarians. That is, they were monotheists who believed in a single creator. The world of Alexandria already more closely resembled the world that would later be established at the Council of Nicaea, but we'll be studying all of this together. But was there a chance to preserve unity, as it might seem to us? In other words, Looking from our perspective today, there was no such chance. That opportunity was not given. It was impossible to preserve unity and reach a common ground. Either one had to abandon one thing and move to another, or abandon another and move to a third. You can't, you couldn't possibly reconcile these things with each other. But into this complicated and boiling family drama, a third force intervenes. A third force steps in. A force that doesn't care about theological subtleties. A force that sees only a potential threat to its order. A force that we call Rome. The Romans first look at Christians. The persecutions under Nero and the subsequent crackdowns will become a catalyst that will force the church to separate even more quickly and to form its own non-Jewish identity. We will talk about this with you next week. And we will go through these things together, little by little, step by step. Christians had a simple choice to stand with the persecuted people of Israel, who by that time had become exiles in their own land, and thus subject themselves and their families to complete banishment, or to turn toward the familiar Roman world and seek answers to their questions there. Today, 2,000 years have passed, and we live in a completely different world. But the foundation of these concepts has not gone anywhere, and the basis laid back then still serves as the foundation for these buildings, both for the synagogue and for the church. But today, our times give us more opportunities to act. Today, we can take action. And today, unlike back then, it is the time of Israel. Back then, it was the decline of Israel. Its time had come to an end. And the time of Rome began, the time of the church, the time of a completely different world. And today, we are living in an entirely different era. Can we understand what was happening back then and what is happening today? Can we trace these threads and understand where our ancestors were and where we are now? From these deep understandings, it will become clear and obvious to us what we should do in these coming times. Again, I want to tell you that there are no simple ideas. There simply are no simple ideas. Just like back then, today we also need to make a choice. And those who make this choice simply find themselves in a new world and a new reality. That's why, amid all the swirling concepts in our minds, there are also the concepts of time and era. A lack of understanding of times, deadlines, eras, and timing will lead us to a complete misunderstanding of our own actions. I wish you all blessings. My friends, to stay up to date, you need to subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a like, and click the bell to get notifications. Shalom to everyone. Thank you for tuning in.